Good evening. This is Mae Brussell. The title of this one-hour broadcast is World Watchers. It is program number 819, August the 17th, 1987. As I mentioned before and will repeat for those listeners who are used to getting the tapes or hearing this program on other radio stations, after 16 and a half years on the air, I'm changing the format of my research, and World Watchers, the way it is presented now by subscription with tapes going to other stations or individually, will cut off at broadcast number 825, September the 28th, which is 6 weeks from now. I might have mentioned there's about 20 reasons for making this change, and I'm very excited about them. And maybe at the end of that last broadcast, as the tapes go out by subscription, I will give you some of those 20 reasons. As I said before, the tapes are available from 1977 to 1987, the past broadcast, so you can order those back tapes if you want to study the material that I have on the air. Remember, Kazoo will continue its format with 1 hour of news and 1 hour of talk show, but I'm also going to change it and have guests, just as I did Bo Greitz last week. It was a very popular program. People liked it very much, and I may have a guest for 1 or 2 hours and then also take calls and have people from all over the country, various researchers and writers and people that you may want to share your time with, and the locals will have advantage of that. There are no more sheets going out by request, no longer with the bibliography and the material for what you heard on the air, and there are no articles being copied by request. I'm just not able to answer all the mail, and while I would be able to do this, I don't want to do it. I want to start writing. The only exception to this statement that applies is people who have used the material in some way that is noticeable to me, not to themselves, but to me. The Iran-Contra affair has been going on since October the 5th, 1986, almost a year now, since Eugene Hassenfuss landed in Nicaragua. There are talk shows around the country from coast to coast and up north, south, east, and west. There are very few people that use this material in any form on any talk show that I know of, with the exception of Willard Harris up in Berkeley. I hope he doesn't mind my mentioning his name. He'll call and ask me about certain questions if a guest is on Larry King, the television, or otherwise, if there's important talk shows or guests, people in the area that are controversial, and we share material, and he has called up and used the name of Mae Brussell as being knowledgeable on this material. And nobody that I know of, I haven't had a response from people who have all of this, get it in the mail, then put it in a drawer or on the wall, and don't use it. And they had ample opportunity during the Iran-Contra hearings to call in to Washington and share it with Pacifica or other talk shows in their area. And I really feel that if it's going to sit somewhere on a table or between the ears of people, it is a lot of work to be shelved that way. And if it's not going to be used in that way, I'm going to write, and I'll be very satisfied to do that. Plus, I'm going to continue for the people in the listening area, those that can have the radios to pick it up. I feel stronger than ever about my local community, about the people in Watsonville, Santa Cruz, down to Big Sur, and the areas all around. I'm very happy with that. So that is the area I'm going to share with on the air, and the rest I will write about. A week from Friday, on August 31st, Daniel Sheehan is coming here to Monterey Peninsula to talk about the Christic Institute. He's going to share his information on the secret team that he's studied for 25 years, beginning with the Contra War in Cuba in 1959. The key person, of course, being Robert Mayu there of the Hughes Organization and Richard Nixon. He will be speaking at the new forum. They're going to have a luncheon downtown at the Monterey Sheraton. It'll be at 12 noon. The reservations are $13. It has to be paid in advance. Call 625-9967 or write the new forum, P.O. Box 22214, Carmel, California 93922. He doesn't get this way very often, and this is an opportunity for the people around here to see a man who has taken the information about assassinations, drug running, and covert operations and put it into a court case. It's probably the most important case that I can think of in the United States, not at the present time, but probably the first one of its kind in a court of law, because the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee on Assassinations were not legal activities. They were just hanky-panky and hocus-pocus. I got a lot of telephone calls at home last week after I had Bo Greitz on the air asking for where they could get his videotape of Kung Sa and the drug dealer, the drug king in Burma, and his desperation in dealing with people like Richard Armitage, the Deputy Director of Defense under Weinberger, and Theodore Shackley, and of course we know the Shackley-Klein Secord Hakim network, and Eric von Marbod. Kung Sa talks about that with Bo Greitz on his tape. The address, again, that I gave last week is the American Freedom Information Network, 2140 West Chapman Avenue, number 223, Orange, California, 92668. And I believe the videotape was $6, allow for tax and postage. Also, I want to tell you one more time about the book that came out of James Earl Ray. It's called Tennessee Waltz, and I suggest you get that. There's a lot of important information, and you can write to St. Andrews Press, St. Andrews, Tennessee, 37372. The publisher of this book has disappeared, according to Ted Gandolfo in New York, and hasn't been located since this book came out. I have a letter that was written to James Earl Ray in the prison in November of 1970. It's dated 78, and it came from a person. I'll read it to you, and it's interesting because it involved J. Edgar Hoover and the Martin Luther King assassination. It was sent to me by Ted Gandolfo, and from James Earl Ray. Dear Mr. Ray, I'm sending you a copy of a letter that was sold at auction last summer in Surrey, England. It belonged to the distinguished British art expert Cosmo Moorhouse, who passed away 2 years ago. The letter was written by J. Edgar Hoover, and it brought about $50. Hoover's letter to Cosmo Moorhouse. This letter could prove very damaging to the FBI. As you can see, it mentions you, James Earl Ray, and a William Fox, the wizard artist whose petition for your release was suppressed by J. Edgar Hoover himself. This is listed. I got your address from, he goes into the Bureau of Records. I wish you freedom. And the address of William Fox is on North Broadway. Ted Gandolfo tried to find him, couldn't locate him. Lucian Purdell, it looks like Purdell, wrote to James Earl Ray at Brushy Mountain State Prison, 1978. And this is a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice from J. Edgar Hoover to Mr. Cosmo, it's Monkhouse, not Moorhouse, curator, in care of the Hampshire House, 150 Central Park South. Dear Mr. Monkhouse, we are interested in acquiring any of the original prints and master drawings that evidently he purchased of William Fox, the elusive and wizard figurative art of sculpture. We are chiefly interested in his innovative and caustic monotype drawing of James Earl Ray, Fire Island athletes, and his print titled Crossfire, which depicts the assassination of President Kennedy. Rest assured, I will personally arrange to have any amount of money, our tax dollars, paid to you upon receipt of these drawings in question. They are of vital concern. Yours truly, J. Edgar Hoover. Now, that letter sold for $50, but what was in the drawings of William Fox, or how Mr. Monkhouse happened to obtain them, goodness knows they seem very valuable and may be an important part of the assassination of Martin Luther King. Now, I want to run down with you some of the top stories in the news because I separated approximately 78 main subjects or categories, and of course it's impossible in 1 hour to even touch all of that, so I thought I would just share with you, and I've wanted to do it many, many times over, just to put them in the order, the pile that I cut them, and let you see what a researcher finds in the course of hours, 12 hours of cutting paper sometimes, and then separating them to the very most important, then the important, and then the eventually. I'm going to share some of the very most important that I cut just this week. First, I want to cite an article in the LA Times. It's titled, Says They Confer for 30 Minutes Daily. Carlucci tells of briefing the president. National Security Advisor Frank Carlucci said Thursday he gives Reagan more rather than less information, even more than he wants to know, in contrast to Rear Admiral Poindexter, who deliberately withheld information. Carlucci said that he tells the president, he talks to him, he's a career diplomat who served as deputy to the heads of both the Pentagon and CIA, and I'll do more on that later. He said, my responsibility is to tell him what he needs to know. Is the President of the United States on a need-to-know basis? He said, how is the President to learn if no one tells him? A president is somewhat circumscribed in the way he gets information. He's dependent on the people around him to come forward with information, such as White House Chief of Staff Howard Baker. Baker and I give him, I'd say, more than he wants in a small time. He's getting more than he wants on a need to know. In 30 minutes a day, the President of the United States gets that. Now, Carlucci was Deputy Director of the CIA under Jimmy Carter. Then, after the rescue hostage rescue effort failed, and I'll go into Carlucci a little bit more. I hope I have more time to get into an article on Carlucci. He left the CIA after Carter lost the presidency through people who later went on to work with Ronald Reagan. Then he became Deputy Director in the Defense Department under Ronald Reagan, from Democratic Party CIA, Republican Party Reagan. And he worked there 1981-82. Then he left the Defense Department in the CIA and worked for Sears, Sears Roebuck branch, international weapons manufacturer and delivering, and hired Eric von Marbod, who was under a cloud in the 70s, working with General Secord, Theodore Shackley of the CIA, Thomas Kleins of the CIA, Edwin Wilson of the CIA, and Frank Turple. So he takes von Marbod, who was a partner with those 5 other people, and works with him several years. And then after the Iran-Contra story comes down, he becomes the National Security Advisor. And in the period where he was working for Sears, von Marbod's partners, Secord, Hakim, Shackley, Kleins. Hakim wasn't in the Egyptian sale. He came in later, but Kleins and Shackley and Wilson's in jail, Turple's out loose. They were beginning to work, particularly Kleins and Shackley, with the arms from Poland and Portugal for the Iran-Contra affair. And General Secord for Stanford Technology Trading Group, his partners, then worked for the National Security Council. So this is a man who now comes in as the NSC advisor, where he worked 2 years in the CIA with Carter when Carter's election was sabotaged, 2 years for Reagan while the Reagan administration went rolling into power, and then 2 years with Eric von Marbod, and then back as NSC advisor. So if you want to know why the president has cue cards or looks dumb, he is dumb because he said, my responsibility is to tell him what he needs to know. Well, let's see what else Ronald Reagan would see if he picked up the newspapers and Carlucci team, the Secord Hakim group, weren't telling the president what he needs to know. Let's see what he would find. There's an article in the paper this past week where Ronald Reagan was compared to King Lear. Dr. F. Wills, former foreign minister of Guyana, a member of a fact-finding committee on the Commission to Investigate Human Rights in the United States, said Reagan's 2 feelings were about hostages and Contras. He was uninformed by using reason. King Lear let judgment out and reasons to come in, reasons for doing what he wanted. And this person compared Reagan. He said Reagan had the American Constitution and a written set of rules to obey, and he let the judgment out like King Lear, and his decline happened when he had his reasons for doing it and not his judgment. Incidentally, within the next 2 weeks, I'm going to continue the broadcast I did last week, number 818, on the nomination of FBI Director Judge Sessions, and hopefully then continue and make connections with former FBI Director William Webster, who's now CIA Director. There are links to the murder of Martin Luther King and John Kennedy, to the Nugan Bank, to the secret team to Edwin Wilson, and the murder of the Judge John Wood, who was prosecuting drug dealers. And also next week, I want to give you a detailed analysis of Private Ralph William Myers' airplane trip over Reagan's Eagle's Nest in Santa Barbara, the Reagan helicopter, I call it the Reagan helicopter message that he got, the hints in the news about Bay of Pigs and Donald Nixon and Robert Vesco, Nancy Reagan's desire for a Nobel Peace Prize for her president, and the picture I've put together of that airplane incident in Santa Barbara, which is by far more important than many people might give it the importance of being. and I'll detail that for you. I started outlining it, and I'll do more next week. So let's continue now with what Reagan would see if Frank Carlucci weren't screening for him, and I'll do as many articles of importance that I literally took at random, first on, is enough to fit this sheet of 10 by 14. What would he see in the news? The first is Richard Danner died. He was the hotel manager in Las Vegas who gave Howard Hughes cash to Richard Nixon as a candidate. He also worked with Robert Mayu, who was the key person in the Christic Institute suit that is filed, that begins with Robert Mayu in 1959. This article came out just this past week on Danner's death. It was in the LA Times, August the 7th. On television, if Reagan were allowed to listen, Larry King and Daniel Sheehan of the Christic Institute shared a program. Larry King didn't have the guts to have Sheehan on alone, taking the answers or calls himself. He was so spineless, so he had a guest, George Carver, formerly with the CIA for many years, approximately 26 years, dividing the time with Daniel Sheehan, who has very rare time, precious time on a coast-to-coast program. And the guest, George Carver, they announced, was of the Olin Foundation. He had a grant for studying terrorism or whatever it was. I have the tape. I have to play back the introduction. But what I heard was the Olin Foundation funds, and he works out of the Center for Strategic International Studies. That program was last Monday, August the 10th, 1987. I don't even know if Daniel Sheehan knows this yet, but George Carver's Olin Foundation ties into the very people that the Christic Institute is trying to pinpoint as the source of the problems in their affidavit. Albert Hakim, the key man over General Secord, who purchased Mr. Otto von Bolschwing, I call it a slip of the tongue, Adolf, think of Hitler, Otto von Bolschwing's TCI Corporation. Albert Hakim worked for Olin Foundation. He worked for William Simon, and Olin Foundation money that went to him, approximately $6 million, he got more, was to bribe Iranian officials. The Olin Foundation funds are managed by William Simon, who's a Knight of Malta. He's on the board of Accuracy in Media. He's on Reagan's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. He's the head of AmeriCares that funds the Contras. The Olin Foundation came from a giant chemical and weapons conglomerate. Well, Albert Hakim pocketed and profited at least $1 to $6 million and many more that were mentioned in a suit in New England a while back, and came to California and bought the California network of Helene von Damm, translator for that network, while she was Reagan's appointment secretary. Then she went to the White House for 2 years after that. Helene von Damm, 6 years rather. So when a person with an Olin Foundation grant is sharing time with Mr. Sheehan, Danny Sheehan, who's the attorney prosecuting this well-known case from the Christic Institute against the Iran-Contra killers, drug runners, and so forth, Larry King has a guest on to eat up the time and to put down what is being said by Daniel Sheehan and the listeners who call in. Another article Reagan might like to see is by Christopher Hitchens. It was in Nation magazine, August the 1st, 1987, and he begins the article by comparing Oliver North to Adolf Hitler's Freikorps. Well, if he looked a little carefully into the history books, there are direct links of Oliver North to the Freikorps and the persons who killed off political candidates from the time period of 1919 until 1933 when Hitler became president. Another article interesting from the Miami Herald by Alfonso Sciardi. He's without a doubt the greatest person on the Iran-Contra affair, and week after week he puts out marvelous articles. This is called Memos Detail High-Level Infighting, Foreign Policy Battle from May 14th, 1982. And this is a good story on the people in the White House shifting gears. Reagan was in 1.5 years as president. He didn't bite the bullet in March of 81, neither did the Pope in May of 81. But by May 82, the CIA, William Casey, George Shultz were all infighting terribly, as they were the first month that Reagan was president, and setting the team members in operation that became the Iran-Contra affair players. A story by Lou Cannon, who follows the president, San Jose Mercury, August the 10th. It's titled, This Lame Duck Can Run. And in it, he compares Ronald Reagan to a magician or to the great Houdini. I've said on the air or with friends and other shows broadcast that, and on the telephone many times, that Ronald Reagan's affairs handling this whole Iran operation are similar to that Copperfield who makes the Statue of Liberty disappear, or Houdini. And it's interesting to see these comparisons written by Lou Cannon, who follows him, because these are the two states of mind, the things that I see when I think like a quick Rorschach, Reagan, Iran-Contra. I think of Magician and the great Houdini. A story came out in March, it was March 5th, 1987, Washington Post. CIA Deputy Chief McMahon resigns, leaving way for more active policy in the Third World. He didn't like the way the CIA was going. He said there was more money for covert actions than for actual information gathering. The White House didn't want information. This article talks about $500 million that would be in the control, and probably still is, of Richard Pearl, because McMahon resigned. Pearl, Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy. And then Robert Gates became the deputy under William Casey when McMahon conveniently resigned. And he was a specialist in Soviet studies, chief intelligence on the National Security Council, then became deputy director of the CIA. When Gates was nominated to become CIA director, there was very little about his being, or at least I didn't see it, being on the National Security Council before. Now, the Washington Post story said McMahon went up through the ranks. He worked on the U-2 spy plane. I might add that so did Edwin Wilson, who's part of that whole von Marbod, Secord, Shackley Klein's group. So did Lee Harvey Oswald at the Minsk Radio Factory. So did James McCord with his 16-man unit emergency team that would activate a martial law plan in 1971-72. And so did Reverend Ed Butler, who was working at Lockheed, then moved up to Idaho to become head of the Aryan Nations. They were all active in the U-2 program, and of course the purpose of that was to break D'Entente and stop Eisenhower from meeting with the Russians, and it worked. Another story this week, early arms help to Iran, Israeli tie known to the CIA. Early arms help to Iran. Israel tie known to the CIA. This is a long article. Also mentioning the arms help came in 1981. This has to do with the hostage rescue. It came out in the San Jose Mercury, August the 9th. It also came out in the Miami Herald. It's about the October surprise. The Miami Herald has a picture of Barbara Honegger, who lives here in Pacific Grove, California. If you send $10, she'll send you her papers and facts, almost a mini book on Reagan's stolen election. Her address is 101 14th Street, Pacific Grove, California, 93950, and she's also worked on the articles impeachment for Ronald Reagan. Many of you might have read the book Prescription for Disaster, or you might not have. It's about the Challenger going down, written by Joseph Trento. And in this book, he cites the fact that astronaut Krista McAuliffe, the late Krista, was muzzled about speaking around the NASA people or privately on her admiration for President John Kennedy. And in this book, he mentions that NASA's official boss, James Beggs, said that the White House was very upset and that Deaver stopped it, that she couldn't publicly say her admiration for John Kennedy. Now, we keep hearing about La Prensa down in Nicaragua, and we can't have peace talk in Nicaragua unless they have free speech. But this president of the United States wouldn't allow an astronaut to praise another president of the United States, even though when he gives speeches, he quotes John Kennedy because he wants to sound like John Kennedy. He doesn't have the head of him, but he doesn't want an astronaut to say that she admired a former president who happened to be a Democrat. The New York Times had a long article this past March, which I've saved and haven't yet put on the air, so some of these dates go back, but I just pulled them out this week because I don't want to miss not sharing them with you. The title of the article is Under Carlucci, the Word is Process. And it's in this article that it says Frank Carlucci was deputy director of CIA under Jimmy Carter, and this is when the debate papers were stolen and when the hostage rescue was sabotaged. Also, Frank Carlucci, as I said, was deputy director of the Pentagon, 1981 and 82. And the people who helped in the taking the Carter papers for the president or sabotaging the rescue operation, Edwin Meese, Richard Allen, William Casey, Frank Carlucci, and General Secord all got top appointments after the election was successful, and they succeeded in ruining Jimmy Carter so that they could be in office. And then Meese becomes the Attorney General. He's Chief of Staff. Richard Allen was National Security Advisor. William Casey, CIA Director. Carlucci, deputy under the Defense Department under Weinberger, and General Secord was given the operations through Willard Zucker and Lake Resources for the Iran-Contra arms. Now, Albert Hakim, who joined this gang after Iran was overthrown and Khomeini came in power, he came to California, as I say, with the Stanford Technology Training Group, and with the millions of dollars was that the Olin money that he bought the TCI Corporation that Von Damm was translator for, that worked with Reagan, that has direct links through people like Edward Teller of Star Wars and Western Goals and Ronald Reagan's Star Wars operations. The money that Hakim had when he came to California set up what became the operational arm of the White House when Ronald Reagan was elected, and Hakim worked with Secord, who was in on the Iran hostage, and also Oliver North moved into the NSC when Reagan became president, and high up in the NSC, and he was also on the board of Turkey and the Iranian border at the time of the hostage rescue. It didn't also include in this article, the one from the New York Times, March 30th, it says, with Carlucci on the National Security Council is Sven Kramer, a hardline arms control expert, who has been an ally of the defense system. Now, Gates was in the NSC, then he goes to the CIA. Carlucci's with the CIA, then he goes to the Defense Department. Oliver North is with the Defense Department, then he goes to the NSC. And Sven Kramer seems to be the liaison of the NSC to the defense, to the president. He's the son of Anton Gustav Fritz Kramer of the Pentagon National Security Council. Star Wars partner Daniel Graham, he shares spaces with him. The mentor of Kissinger and Haig. And remember, in February, Evans and Novak wrote about the saving grace of the NSC was that Carlucci was keeping Sven Kramer on. And this article tells as if we didn't need to know about his hardline work in the Defense Department. Another long article from the Miami Herald by Alphonse Shardy. It is April the 1st, 1987. CIA is airdropping Contra for the Contra saboteurs. While the Bolin Amendment was activated, they wanted to be very sure that Americans weren't doing the material, so they hired the mercenaries from Rhodesia, from Belgium, and then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers stood outside in Honduras, El Salvador, and directed their mercenaries from London and so forth to sabotage and blow out the electricity. And the story of what they did is horrendous. This article is a very complete article on that matter. If you can get Miami Herald, Alfonso Sharday. If Reagan would like to read the news, I have some more stories we could share or he might see. A long article, magazine length, in Daily News Digest, a weekly review of world events that comes out of Phoenix, Arizona, called AIDS Man-Made. And it goes on to say, don't believe that it might not be man-made, and the reasons for that are stated. The publication is volume 13, number 32, P.O. Box 39027, Phoenix, Arizona, 85069. And that is why I say tape record these programs. You can erase them later, because these addresses you're going to get not on the telephone by calling my house. I'm not going to look them up. And you can get them by taping the broadcast and writing them over or writing them down as I go. A lot of articles have come out on the death squads in Los Angeles. The Guardian had a long one, July 28th, 1987. Death squads invade Los Angeles. Their death threats against the El Salvadorian activists. And a gentleman in charge of the Immigration and Naturalization Services in L.A., I don't have his name, I didn't bring it to the station. He said that the El Salvadorians were doing this to get attention, and they weren't getting these threats, and members of Congress have challenged this person on saying that. There have been quite a long series of obituaries and articles. Final tribute to Jesse Unruh, Big Daddy of California politics. Los Angeles Herald had a nice one. This was August the 10th, 1987. You people on the East Coast, Northwest, South, other than the L.A. area particularly, and in California, are not aware of Jesse Unruh. He headed the John Kennedy the election victory in 1960 in California and helped run the nomination in the election. He was in the Ambassador Hotel when Senator Robert Kennedy was murdered. He ran against Reagan for governor and lost. He dies of cancer, and the other old goat, who's had a few operations, is still surviving and is plenty mean. We'll take a 1-minute break and then run down some news stories that the president might see if Frank Carlucci didn't tell him what he needed to know for 30 minutes a day. This is Mae Brussell. This is the second half of World Watchers, program number 819. I have a very good book on the contest for governor in California of Jesse Unruh with Ronald Reagan. And just think, if Unruh had won, it would have changed the whole history of the world probably, except that enough people didn't go out to vote for Unruh. They voted for Ronald Reagan, and now look what they got. The Los Angeles Herald had a story, August the 10th, "Don't Cut Reagan's Defense Budget." And when I see those titles, I always look for the author. Of course, it's Caspar Weinberger. L.A. Herald, the same date, August the 10th, said, "U.S. clearing Gulf for Iran's tankers, too." It's an article by William Safire in making the area safe for all ships in the Gulf at the cost now of $2 million a day for the United States. We're also protecting the Iran tankers at the same time. Washington Post, August the 5th, had one of many, many articles. I have approximately several hundred to condense to three or four. Well, I don't have the main broadcast now, but condense for you. Edwin Meese and the WedTech Corporation. One is titled, "Meese Failed to Follow Ethics Rules, General Accounting Office Says in His Partnership with WedTech." And, of course, remember the ethics rules and the questions when he was nominated to become Attorney General that were so overwhelming. The man should have been kicked out of the place, even out of the city and the White House. Washington Post, August 5th, 1987, USSR and Iran plan joint economic projects. Now that Reagan has messed up the Middle East sufficiently, the Soviet Union and Iran are beginning to work together better. The Washington Post had an article, August the 5th, again the same day, "United States inquiry into Benjamin Linder's death is faulted." There was a shot close to the head, similar to the way Thane Caesar shot Robert Kennedy at the Ambassador Hotel. The reason for saying that Benjamin Linder was killed in Nicaragua was because he was helping some very evil people who won't let La Prensa be open, and the priests can't have freedom of speech to lambast the existing government, so therefore he deserves to die. And many of you might have seen in the newspaper the obscene articles about George Bush debating Linder's death with his brother, as if there's something to debate about, when all these piles of newspaper articles that I see tell about American troops in Nicaragua, Americans training them, the State Department, the CIA, the NSC, the NSA, and every branch of government helping to kill over there. The thing is to kill and take over the country from the existing government. Another article, controversial article about Congressman Bo Bolter from Texas. The San Francisco Chronicle had the story August 14th. Bo Bolter says that the rich are entitled to better health than the poor. And he gave a very clear speech in Texas that because you're poor, you can't have all the things that we have, or you would be bankrupt. And if we're rich, we're entitled to better care. And Medicare is going to be too high for you, and that's the best you can get for whatever it is, that the rich are more entitled to better health care than the poor. Now, this may sound funny or obscene or ridiculous. Why cite such a silly story? That's exactly what happened in Nazi Germany, and there were more sympathizers with this line of thinking than caring about the poor. And as they read the figures that the cure of AIDS is going to cost billions and billions of dollars, are you going to side up with the homosexuals or a few heterosexuals that have the disease? Or are you going to save the money for better health care for the rich because the poor are going to die anyway or don't deserve to have the money? The People's Daily World had a long article, and I have approximately 30 of them now that the commission hearings, the Iran-Contra hearings are over. I guess it is a congressional commission. This one's titled, "Many Questions Remain in Iran-Contra Probe." More are remaining now that were answered at the time, and there are a series of those articles. I'm sure many of you have seen them. People's Daily World ran a very good series to this entire affair, keeping people up to date on the important parts of it. The Washington Post had a story August 13, 1987, "Nuclear Damage in the Bikini Islands." The American Medical Association Journal. Recent study shows that the Marshall Islands between the 1940s and 1950s had nuclear damage to the people. I mentioned the movie that I saw at the Monterey Film Festival last year called Half-Life, about U.S. experiments with the hydrogen bomb. They knew it would land on civilian populations, and they wanted to test the consequences of that on the Bikini Atoll and Marshall Islands. Well, now they're testing it. So what you're getting are the reports. Yes, they have cancer. There's nuclear damage. The movie showed the first generation after the bombs were tested, and a lot of the children, their heads and bodies were like jelly, and they're carried around in carts. But the studies are continuing, and so they can say, almost 40 years later, yes, it damaged the children and the grandchildren, and read it in the AMA. The Los Angeles Times had a long story, August the 8th. Schultz publicly backs Panama opposition. The point is that George Shultz, the saint of the Iran-Contra hearings, had a little secret he wasn't told about, that money went from Iran to the Contras. But publicly, you can overthrow a country. There's no more secrets. You just invade, you take over, you get rid of Noriega, the powers that be. So now he's very proud to say publicly, and there's an article in the syndicated column section that goes around the country by Henry Kissinger on the mistake of Ronald Reagan with the Iran-Contra. He should have just boldly said, this is what I'm going to do, instead of doing surreptitiously. So now we have to face the raw fascists, and do you have the strength or knowledge to oppose them, as they don't have to hide behind various editors' desks and hope they won't be exposed. Another Miami Herald article, lawmaker says the Gulf escorts violated the ban. The reflagging has been challenged by more than 100 members of the Senate and House, although we're doing it, and they want George Shultz to talk about the war, writing down about whether you want the war emergency powers, and of course he's putting off the name war while the fleets go in heavily armed and seem to be violating certain bans. Miami Herald had another large story, AIDS kills first Chinese hemophiliac got to U.S. blood. So out of that great nation with so many people, a person has to get a transfusion from America, and that begins the first AIDS case. It reminds me of the British and the Spanish and the invaders coming in this country, and wherever they went, over the seas, bringing disease, tobacco, and so forth, and a lot of things that killed native populations. So now the Chinese have to get it from a blood transfusion in America. Washington Times had a long story, August the 5th. Arms profits lure firms into doing business with the Soviets. And the article is arms companies everywhere. And it literally says that there's no distinction between the Soviets and America. They're selling arms happily to the Soviets and happily to anybody who opposes the Soviets, and the profits are huge. Of course, many of you read or heard that the FCC rescinds the fairness doctrine. The Washington Post has a long article. Almost every one of my papers, and you're sure, on the broadcasters hail the end to intrusion. Well, the broadcasters are hired by the corporations, such as NBC is now owned by General Electric, and the corporations run. Metro Media bought Capital Cities, bought ABC, and Ted Turner is doing a very good job of putting the right-wing persons on talk shows and having right-wing guests and pushing the Oliver North video and so forth. So they would be glad not to have the fairness doctrine, because the multinationals own the airwaves, so they can put out where they want now, and they don't have to be fair to anybody. Another long article from the Washington Post this past week, United States activity in the Gulf may have triggered new Iran radicalism, and there are quite a few on the Gulf, and I bring them up because we're getting closer to World War III and Ronald Reagan's wonderful dream of Armageddon that Jerry Falwell has given him, and the religious fundamentalists. The Washington Post, I guess, there's a series of papers that I read and prefer a lot of their articles because they're easily available in the library. This one is titled, Cord Blamed for Damage to NASA's $4 million Rocket. This is a light cord that got in the way, described in the newsprint just a few weeks ago, that damaged this big, expensive rocket. Miami Herald again had a story, Elliot Abrams okayed arms shipments, officials say, and this goes into quite a lot of detail and length on Abrams, who appeared so innocent that he didn't know what was going on in Central America, and everybody knows he was lying. He's deputy director of CIA of the Western Hemisphere, and of course he knew about arms shipments, but this article is new in that they have evidence and documents that he personally okayed them during the time of the Boland Amendment, when the Defense and State Department and other agencies were told not to be doing that. The Washington Times had a long article, powerful B-52 bomb comes out of mothballs. They are ready to be deployed. I could do 1 hour just on new weapon systems, or 1 hour on arms to Iran, or 1 hour of NASA and Defense Department waste, where things like these cords get in the way, or 1 hour on the Gulf. I'm just taking a few of these stories to give a sample of what I'm getting in my newspapers. I don't know how many you're getting. The Miami Herald also had a story, U.S. journalists, drug charges are dropped. This is Martha Honey and Tony Abergan. They are the plaintiffs from the Christic Institute suit against 28 or 29 defendants of a huge broad sweep of the secret team. Trumped-up charges were placed against them of having drugs that they picked up a package at the post office, and it was mailed to them in their name, and it allegedly had drugs to imply that they were great drug dealers. I'm sure that the $60,000 that General Secord, who does participate in drug traffic with Mr. Robinette of the CIA, who got $60,000 from Secord to frame the Christic Institute or find out about their witnesses, I'm sure that a hunk of this money, $60,000 or $8,000 a month or $4,000 a month, could have some narcotics mailed to these people who go to their box to pick up the mail, and then the police are there and they say, oh, you're a drug trafficker. Well, the point about all this is that they're living in Costa Rica. They travel in Central America, exposing the drug traffic, the gun running, the assassinations, the planned coups. They're still barred from leaving Central America. So they're really house prisoners until the whole thing is over. And it's ridiculous that they would be charging the Contras and John Hull and persons around him with drug traffic, and that they would be getting drugs from Nicaragua. Also, the Washington Times had a story this week, Iran's trial of arms deal and the leak to the Lebanon newspaper by Mahdi Hashemi will undermine Hussein Ali Montazeri. It's a story about Oliver North and Robert McFarlane visiting Iran. We know about the newspaper that printed that they were there, and the persons who undermined this transaction connected to Khomeini's competitor for the great role of running Iran, whoever would want it, they're going to be tried. The person who leaked the story is going to be tried. And while Khomeini deals with people who want to kill him, like Khomeini will work with the secret team, he's going to prosecute the people who blew the story because Iran needs the arms. They don't care who delivers them. So the person who blew the story is a traitor, and the traitor was the opponent to Khomeini, who probably they wanted to show that Khomeini works with America, the evil empire, reversing that story. San Jose Mercury had a long story, de-escalate in the Gulf. It's probable the United States will be drawn into an armed conflict with Iran. I don't know how you feel about that. We just blatantly talk about World War III and World War IV, and there are people that are aware of it, but we all seem, we collectively, totally defenseless to stop this craziness and to use whatever energy we have to get those ships out of there and come home. As a matter of fact, we not only de-escalate, but you read the news today that Ronald Reagan is going to send $1 billion of weapons to Saudi Arabia, and I'll do more on that next week in conjunction with that episode that took place with the airplane over his ranch and some of the reasons for Reagan now becoming so interested again in arming the Contras and in sending the weapons to Saudi Arabia. I think Reagan got the message and loud and clear, and he's ready to deliver. Remember the movie The Godfather, with a horse's head was cut off and it was put in bed, and the message was to shut up. Well, a person doesn't have to be killed. All you find is a horse's head in the bed or an airplane 100 feet from you, and you change your particular stance if you can. And Reagan's trying to placate the right and the left, the hard critics of the conservative group and the others who say, look, the game is up. You may as well go down in history. So while persons writing articles are worried about the escalation, he has, as of today, increased it one more time. And as I say, getting out the B-52s, he's ready to go into the Gulf as much as he wants, even though it could possibly lead to World War III. The New York Times had a story, Scientist Defies Federal Rules on Genetic Testing. And it refers to various companies and scientists like those with advanced genetic scientists who don't like their restrictions, and they're going to go ahead and test without being cleared because they want to do it. There are billions of dollars in it. It doesn't matter who's sick. The article doesn't say that, but that's the intent. Don't stop what we're doing. We're going to go forward. And, of course, Mr. Graham of the former NASA program, when it was blown up, moved to the White House where he's in charge of the science group and works with the people of AGS, Mr. Beauregard from Harvard that I've talked about. So now they're on their own. This is the Reagan, Ollie North, William Poindexter, William Casey, John Poindexter, William Casey mentality, Robert Owen. We do it on our own because we want to. The King Lear problem of using the reasonings or feelings that are weak and not their judgment that it isn't legal to do this. It hasn't been proven to be safe. The Washington Times had a story, new Navy minesweepers hit snag on engine design. We give the Pentagon all the money it wants. We let it go anywhere we want. And then when it doesn't function, we just say, whoops, we made a mistake. The same way there was a story this week about Rockwell International getting $1.5 billion to replace the Challenger. If there's icicles on the Challenger and you want to get that teacher up in space because it's the night of the State of the Union, you flip a coin and you take your chances. And if it doesn't work and the rainbow group of astronauts is down in the ocean or blown up and then down, then you go ahead and get the contracts to build some more. The only thing that happens is the astronauts are gone, and there's still a lot of patriotic people that want to be astronauts that can't see this. But the important thing is that we make these pieces of machinery, and we have sitting ducks, Americans will be killed all over the world, but that doesn't matter to the people at home who see the killing of their own, and they rationalize the president's decisions. The CIA is everywhere. They're in the Philippines. I have a very intense article on John Singlab with death squads in the Philippines, and he's in Laos. And then there was another story in the Washington Times. U.S. conducts joint maneuvers with Somalia. There isn't an area or an inch of planet gold that we don't want to control and own. And if you enlarge that, another story this past week, CIA interfering to destabilize India. No place is precious. We have our eyes on overthrowing Ghana, and several people linked to Ollie North were stopped. That doesn't mean we won't try again, and the Americans are very ingenious at going back until they succeed at these operations. The Washington Times had a long article, as did the LA Times, on AIDS, and this one cited August the 4th, says researchers link parasite with AIDS in Africa, and now they're getting into ways AIDS can be carried and live in certain parasites, and the real truth about how AIDS are developed is yet to be exposed from Fort Detrick, Maryland. The Washington Times had an article, August the 4th, Pat Robertson, who's running for president, ties dirty tricks to George Bush, the former CIA director, and they would know what dirty tricks are. And also another article, Representative Jack Kemp says that he's the victim of dirty tricks used by George Bush's aides. Now, Bush can say, of course, I didn't know what they were doing, but the CIA is notorious in overthrowing elections and getting who they want, and Robertson is complaining about dirty tricks from Bush, and so is Jack Kemp. The Miami Herald had a long article, this is July 30th, clothing funds went for arms. Many of you heard Robert Owen testify, and then George Shultz from the State Department, and now they're finally admitting that the $27 million that was supposed to go to State Department for non-lethal aid went in what was clothing were weapons. They were mixed together, and that the Bolin Amendment was shot full of holes for about 80 different reasons and ways, and so mixed with the clothing are arms. The Los Angeles Times had a story August the 8th. Israeli says Walsh must withdraw 2 subpoenas. Several Israelis were supposed to testify before the special prosecutor about the links of Israel to arms to Iran and to the Contra. Israel says, nope, go away. We withdraw your subpoena. It's not that you're going to serve it and we won't get it. Withdraw it. We don't have to count to you. We're your 51st state. Forget about it and don't bother us. Speaking of 51st state, did you notice, or I read in the paper, I haven't gotten it yet, the $1 stamp that has the Star of David engraved into the beard of his elderly Jewish person on the stamp. Miami Herald, July 31st, has a story, White House knew of Miami probe of gun-running drugs. Long articles came out just last week on how long the White House knew, and this is actually from May of 86. The Christic Institute was filed in May 29th, but the intent to file it, the pre-legal work, was put together from a year before, from 1985, and they filed in May of 86. But the White House was very well aware. Edwin Meese helped stop the investigation. William Webster helped stop it. The CIA, the FBI, William Casey, they were all part and parcel of sabotaging countries and interfering with the rights of others, and also working with gun runners and narcotic traffickers. And they were aware of what was going on and stopped those investigations. This is a long article on that. The New York Times had a story August the 1st. Link in Contra supply gets immunity. Lieutenant Colonel Richard B. Gadd, who was part of the Stanford Technology Trading Group, an important link to the arms that went to the Contras, is getting immunity by Lawrence Walsh, which is interesting. I read a shocking article that so far he's given 22 people immunity. He's given Robert Owen immunity and so forth, but 22 people immunity. Then he'll go for a handful of people who will all be released by Ronald Reagan, and that way everybody gets off. It is really sickening to see how this is operating, and he's working sort of on the principle of Watergate, and Watergate was based on Nuremberg. Use a handful of Nazis and let the 40, 50,000 hard Nazi war criminals out, have 12 charged, a few were hung, and then release the others. John J. McCloy, who was a member of the Warren Commission and High Commissioner to Germany, who worked with the top Nazis, his job, and Senator Joe McCarthy, his first year in the Senate, were to release the Nazi war criminals so they could be useful to America. There was a long article in the London Times, July 26, titled Mises' Enemies to Move in for the Kill. And London must think that we've gone bananas picking on Edwin Meese. The paper, the London Times, is owned by Mr. Murdoch, and I did some broadcasts about Murdoch and the London Times and Edwin Meese a while back when Mike Royko resigned from the Chicago Tribune, I believe it was. He had written a column for years because Murdoch plunked down approximately, I forget what it was, 30 or 40 million, bought the entire paper and said, I don't want to hear any more about Edwin Meese, his confirmation hearings, or criticism of the Grenada operations and the coup we had in Grenada. So for approximately 40 million, he just bought the whole newspaper because you weren't supposed to know about Ed Meese, and maybe they didn't want you to know about Mr. Gifrida and FEMA and the rounding up of people, rounding up the 21 million that would be in the hands of 21 million blacks would be in the hands of Ollie North. So the one newspaper, one of the two major newspapers in Chicago, was bought to stop inquiries into Edwin Meese being printed in the news media. And the London Times has this long article, Enemies Move in for the Kill. The San Francisco Examiner and other papers and the Wire Service. Atlanta murder files open. Wayne Williams' conviction is challenged. You know, how many of these articles, as I say, each one of them is a separate story on the framing of Wayne Williams and the links of the murders of the black young men to the Ku Klux Klan. I've done broadcasts on that. And also, after 20 years, the L.A. Herald and the L.A. Times have an article, August the 4th, Senator Robert Kennedy's assassination files to be opened. Ronald Reagan should be reading some of these papers. Carlucci shouldn't just tell him for 30 minutes what's out there. It was Ronald Reagan who worked with Patrick Frawley and people that were very much involved in the Robert Kennedy story, the characters involved in the Kennedy assassination with his linkage to Edgar Eugene Bradley, and that network of the secret team that have been doing murders under the marriage of Robert Mayo of the CIA, FBI, Hughes organization with the Defense Department and the CIA and FBI. Ronald Reagan should be reading some of these stories. My goodness, what would he do? Nation magazine, in an article, August the 1st issue, Schools for Scandals, a guide to the Iran-Contra theories. You know the word conspiracy theorists? Now, after just citing some of the most interesting, and I have 4 times amount that much that I would like to share with you about this past week's news. I didn't go into the drug connections, the secret teams, the martial law plan, and so forth. These writers write for Nation, David Korn and Jefferson Morley. Now, they put up a lot of the money for Pacifica to have the Iran-Contra hearings going. The Nation magazine did. And this is, I'm going to read a couple of paragraphs from their article talking about the different theories on Iran-Contra. At the end of one day, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North's testimony before the congressional committees, there were two conspiracy-minded journalists who cornered a committee member and asked what it meant that three figures in the scandal that North was talking about, Director William Casey, Vice Admiral Arthur Moreau, and National Security Staff member Donald Fortier, these were men all over North, one in the Defense Department, Moreau, and one in the NSC, Fortier. What does it mean that they had all died? Yeah, I noticed that, the congressman muttered, to which one of the reporters said, what a plan they had. And then he says, conspiracy theories of the Iran-Contra affair have been flourishing since the first news of the scandal and the testimony of Oliver North. Rear Admiral John Poindexter and others aren't likely to discourage them. What appears in the press as a parade of deceit and battling revelations, punctuated by the emergence of new celebrities, there's a variety of causes that demand explanation. The public and Congress need a comprehensible framework for making sense of the avalanche of details generated by the scandal and the hearings. The death of three Reagan administration officials with links to the scandal is, and he's nice enough to say, probably a coincidence. Many other seemingly puzzling revelations of the past 9 months are not. He does not go into the death of Cyrus Hashemi, who died in London, who's very much tied to Albert Hakim and Adnan Khashoggi and Edwin Meese. He doesn't go into the death of other very important witnesses, one who was killed in Paris, who was responsible for sending the weapons from Poland to ship to Portugal, and so forth. I'm going to run down, hopefully, maybe the last 4 weeks of the formal part of World Watcher that goes out by tape or subscription, the death squads of the Iran-Contra people, the people that they have been mentioned as having a part of murdering or have been identifiably linked with those murders, and to believe that these three are the only ones, and very coincidental is ridiculous. He does say it's probably a coincidence, but come on now, how old do you have to be and how long do you have to go through that BS to know that these are not coincidences? Now, I get a newsletter from France. I've mentioned, pardon the ruffling of papers here. I get a newsletter from France, I've mentioned before, called Intelligence Parapolitics, and you can subscribe to it. P.O. Box 50441, Washington, D.C., 20004-0441. And in there, they're reviewing a book, new book out by William Blum, B-L-U-M, called The CIA, A Forgotten History. It's published in London, so you'll have to try and get it from London, Zed Press, Z-E-D, 57 Caledonian Road, just like it sounds, London, capital N-I or N1, and then 9, the number 9, capital B, capital U. And in this book, it has index notes about the role, in the newsletter, it has index notes about what is reprinted in this book. Until you get the book, it itemizes some of the activities of the CIA. And this intelligence review says the author plunges into a 49-chapter critical history of major CIA covert operations. Each chapter concerns a specific case. They cover from China in 1945 to 1960s to Nicaragua from 1981 until now. There is a critical analysis, well documented, and serves as a very good reference for known material on the CIA interventions, and material that is usually spread out through many, many different books and articles, and we print here the table of contents of this very useful book. And I want to mention that they have these coups in chronological order, and again they carry the Eisenhower Doctrine in the Middle East, in Indonesia, 1957-58, Western Europe and British Guiana, and they come to the 1960s, Western Europe, British Guiana, 1953 to 64, and also Cuba, 1959 to 1980, that's a secret team, and into Indonesia, 1965. I don't see in this contents Brazil, that was overthrown with Frank Carlucci and Vernon Walters. But what's left out of every single one of these things, they're beginning to add them up. I should begin and end every program of World Watchers. What's left out of these chronologies over and over and over again is the 1961 to 63 plans to set up and murder President John Kennedy of the United States. We had a military coup in that time period that was arranged actually from 1959 on with Robert Mayu. The killers are still in power and doing as much killing as ever. They're ready for their Armageddon in the Middle East. And every one of these indexes and books leaves out what happened in Dallas, Texas in 1963, or the killing of a presidential candidate, Robert Kennedy, on the eve of becoming possibly the president in 1968 rather. So I will always interject into these chronologies. Why are people leaving out the American coup, and why can they recognize that we had a coup in 1963 by the military who are active in power today? This is Mae Brussell. I'll be back with you next week, and I thank you for articles you're sending. Remember, no tapes, no calls, no bibliographies. I'm easing out of that part. You tape it off the air, or if you subscribe, you'll get the sheets for a few more weeks. I'll be back with you next week to continue on these subjects.